On the first Easter Sunday, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome went to the tomb to complete the burial preparations. They had been unable to finish anointing Jesus' body with oil and perfumes on Friday because the sun had started to set. The Sabbath was about to begin. So they went back the Sunday morning, Easter morning, to complete those tasks. They arrive, they find the stone rolled away, they find the tomb empty. They go and tell Peter. Peter and John go to the empty tomb. John describes this in chapter 20 of his gospel. And in verse 6, he says this: Simon Peter arrived after him. He went into the tomb and saw the burial cloths there. The cloth that had covered his head, not with the burial cloths, but rolled up in a separate place. This reference to the burial cloths is odd. The women had returned to complete the burial preparations. The face covering would actually have been removed before Jesus was put into the shroud. And then the shroud, of course, the bindings would have been untied and the shroud opened up in order for the women to finish the anointing of the body. It's not really clear why John brings this up, but he must have had a reason. It seems that there's something about the burial cloths themselves that's important. This is my speculation. It's just that. I wonder if he was trying to establish the provenance of cloths that the early Christian community still had in its possession. Time had passed. You had a generation that had grown up who didn't witness the events, and John is saying to that audience, "Look, these cloths that we have, they came from the tomb. I was there." In 525, the city of Edessa, this is not Odessa, not the port city in the Ukraine, but Edessa, which was an ancient city in what is today eastern Turkey, it experienced a really catastrophic flood. And after the flood, in the course of the cleanup and restoration work that was done, a cloth was found secreted away in a niche in the city wall. And it was said to be a square cloth that bore a miraculously produced image of the Savior's face. It came to be known as the Mandalion, or the icon of Edessa. There are two or three more references to the Mandalion, which describe it as an imprint. But there's also an 8th century reference that says, there's an 8th century reference to a whole body cloth, a long piece of linen that bears a front and back image of the crucified Christ. And so some being kept at a church in Edessa, which just as a kind of footnote, it makes a certain amount of sense. In the very early years of Christianity, Edessa quickly became a kind of center for Christian scholarship. If an artifact or a relic was going to leave the Holy Land, Edessa is one of the places it would likely have gone. So some researchers have speculated that the Mandalion, the square with the face, was this whole body image simply folded into a square to allow for display of the face, that perhaps that's how it was publicly displayed for a time, but that really, if you unwrap the whole thing, the entire image is there. The Mandalion was translated to Constantinople in 944, and it disappears from the historical record in 1204, immediately following the sack of Constantinople, which occurred as part of the Fourth Crusade. The Shroud of Turin first appears in the historical record 149 years later in 1353. And so the question becomes, is the Shroud of Turin the Mandalion? The shroud came out of a private family collection. When it turned up, the Bishop of Troyes, apologies to anyone who actually speaks French, I do not, wrote a letter to Pope Clement VII claiming the shroud was a forgery and that he knew the artist who had created it. Pope Clement allowed public display of the shroud. He allowed people to form their own opinions about it, but he asked church officials to only refer to it as an icon, which is still the official position of the church today. The church has never pronounced the Shroud of Turin as a genuine artifact of the crucifixion, but it does allow veneration, and it does allow people to hold to the belief that it is the burial cloth of Jesus. In 1898, a man named Secundo Pia photographed the shroud. And when he developed his photographs, he realized that the image on the shroud is actually a negative. The dark areas are light, the light areas are dark. So when you take a picture of it, you look at the negative, you get a positive image. The image really pops. That very famous photograph of the face that everyone knows with regard to the shroud is one of the photographs that Pia took in 1898. In 1978, the church allowed scientific examination of the shroud. A team of scientists from various disciplines was assembled into a project called the Shroud of Turin Research Project. And there's all sorts of information for anyone who's interested, a number of good books. But there's sort of four things that I take from the Shroud of Turin Research Project. The first is that the image contains historically accurate details that a 14th century forger would have been unlikely to know. For example, the man in the shroud the nail wound is in his wrist rather than in his palm. That's more likely to have been the way that Jesus was crucified. But of course, by the medieval period, every crucifix in Europe depicted the nail through the palm. If you were a forger and you were trying to fool an audience, I don't think you would deviate from you would play into their expectations rather than deviate from their expectations, even if you were aware of the historical inaccuracy. The blood stains on the shroud are real human blood. They are type AB, and the blood has separated into plasma and sediment, meaning it came from a person who was newly deceased, very freshly dead. Again, if you were a forger, sheep's blood why go to the trouble of finding actual human blood from a freshly dead corpse? Who in the 14th century is going to be able to tell the difference? Third, there are details in the shroud image that cannot be seen with the naked eye. So, for example, on the back, there are scourge marks, and you can see them, but if you look at them under ultraviolet light, for example, you can make out a great deal more detail. And it turns out that in 1709, at Herculaneum, which was kind of the sister city to Pompeii that was destroyed when Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, a flagrum was found. A flagrum was a kind of Roman whip. It had a wooden handle and three leather tongs or thongs that were maybe a foot or 18 inches. But at the end of each of the leather strips, there was a kind of dumbbell-shaped lead weight, which of course would give the whip a lot more force and do a lot more injury. And these wounds on the back, when you can look at them under with modern imaging techniques, they're exactly the kinds of, forensically, they're the kinds of wounds that would be produced by that instrument. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, the image on the shroud is a scorch. The dark areas, have been burned longer, and the lighter areas have been burned for less time. But that's how the image was produced. A lot of people have come up with ways to create images that to the naked eye look like the shroud. But no one's been able to reproduce this scorching technique. In fact, there's $1 million prize for anyone who can create an image that is actually a scorched image like the shroud, using techniques and materials that would have been available in 14th century Europe. And the prize remains unclaimed. In 1988, there were carbon-14 tests done on the shroud that dated the shroud to 1260 to 1390, a date range that fits well with its appearance in the historical record at 1353. But it was quickly determined that there were some problems with the carbon-14 dating. They fall into sort of two groups. One is that the area that was sampled, they didn't want to damage the image, which is understandable. And the shroud as we have it today is not a single piece of linen. It's been repaired many times. And the samples that were taken from one edge, basically a hem. And they have come from an area of the shroud where that has been repaired using a braiding technique, where you take the old linen fibers and you unwind them, and you take a new piece of linen and you wind them in, so that you have a mix of old and new linen. So that's one issue with the radiocarbon dates. The second issue is that it turns out there are certain types of contamination that are very difficult to remove for purposes of carbon. So, for example, candle smoke, right? This is an object that's been in a church full of candle smoke for centuries. That gets into the fibers of the linen in a way that you can't, that normal cleaning and normal sample preparation can't address. And that's organic material, carbon material that will date. So the scientific situation is kind of interesting in that you've got sort of two camps, well, actually maybe more of a continuum. Everybody agrees that the samples have been affected by, at least potentially affected by repairs, and that there are contaminants present in the samples that would skew the dating in a way that would make the shroud appear to be newer than it actually is. The disagreement is over how big an impact that is, with most of the scientific community saying, yeah, the results are skewed, but they're probably only skewed by a couple of hundred years. They're not skewed by 1,300 years. Versus the minority view, which says, no, these really are not good carbon-14. I mean, the carbon-14 technique is good, but the dates that we've arrived at are way later than the reality because of these contamination issues and repaired fabric. Last month, April of 2022, a new dating technique was applied to the shroud. It's called wide-angle X-ray scattering. I cannot explain that to you. It's a newer and frankly somewhat experimental technique. It hasn't been used yet on a great many objects from antiquity. And so it's not fully accepted. It's not completely clear whether there may be issues with the dating that haven't kind of come to light yet. But it returned a first century date. And because it's non-destructive, you can use it on parts of the shroud that we know are original fabric. And that, again, that returned a first century date. But it turns out, and this is what I really kind of wanted to get to tonight, it turns out that there's a second cloth that's relevant to this debate. It's called the Sudarium of Oviedo, and it's a blood-stained piece of linen measuring about 33 inches by 21 inches that's kept in the Cathedral of San Salvador in Oviedo, Spain. Sudarium is Latin for sweat cloth. It's the term we most commonly use to refer to the head covering part of the burial cloths that would have been used in Jesus' case. The Sudarium has interesting connections to the shroud. The blood stains on it are human. They are type AB, just like we find on the shroud. The plasma and cellular sediment have separated, so again, the blood comes from a freshly dead person. If you take the Sudarium and you configure it as it would have been, tied under the chin at the corners with a portion draped over the face, the blood stains match up very well to wounds that we see on the face and head of the man in the shroud. Both the shroud and the Sudarium have the same, not unknown, but infrequently used Z twill pattern. They're both high-end pieces of linen woven using a particular technique. They may well have come from the same bolt of cloth, so they may have been, the cloth would have been pulled out, cut for one, and pulled out, cut for the other. So it seems very likely that they have a common origin. But the Sudarium has a documented history that goes all the way back to 570, when we know it was in Jerusalem. It was later taken to Egypt, then to Spain, and then as Egyptian Christians fled the advancing Persian army of Khosrau II, it arrived in Cartagena, moved around Spain a bit in connection with the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. It was taken to Seville, spent some time in Toledo. It was hidden for a while somewhere in Asturias. We don't know exactly where. That's in the northern coast of Spain. It was finally translated to Oviedo in 840, and that's where it's been ever since. So the point is that this Sudarium and the Shroud almost certainly have a common origin. The Sudarium is demonstrably older than the carbon-14 tests. And if that's so, then the carbon-14 tests that are the primary reason for rejecting the Shroud's authenticity are really not a very good indicator of its age. That the Shroud would therefore be much older than skeptics now claim. So I wanted to make you aware of that bit about the Sudarium, which is a piece that not very many people know, but that lends a lot of weight and a lot of support to the authenticity of the Shroud. So thank you.